War Beneath the Roots is a fantasy fiction podcast. While rooted in tabletop storytelling, this is a fully written narrative crafted for audio. Video versions are available to enhance the experience with maps and art, but they're not necessary. This podcast contains violence and themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. She stood atop the hollowed hill. Beneath her, the dead writhed. Bone-stitched husks, eyes bright with hunger. They knelt at her feet, waiting. The grove answered her summons. Roots burst from the earth, thick as thighs, hard as iron. Branches hissed, leaves black as tar. Deer sprang from shadow, antlers dripping spores. Wolves emerged, fur bristled with decay. Then the trees themselves awoke, trunks cracked, bark peeling back like shattered armor. Limbs clawed skyward, talons gouging the low clouds. Ancient oaks marched in silent rows, roots rattling stone. She raised a hand, a single command. Bloom. The wind carried her voice through twisting limbs, a single pulse of wild magic. Animals bowed, zombies rose, every creature, every branch, every hollow root, loyal to her will. Her heart thundered with power, her mouth tasted of sap and blood. She was the bloom's mouth, her only truth. Cleanse the land, remake the world. In the gathering darkness, life and death converged. The grove surged forward, and she walked at its head. I am Benjamin Harris. Welcome to War Beneath the Roots. Chapter 13. Dawn came gray and uneasy, the sky shuttered by low clouds. Markin woke to the hiss of damp leaves against his bedroll. Blue lay curled on his mat near the cold embers of last night's fire, steam drifting from his flared nostrils. At the forest's edge, Beam stood rooted like a sentinel, spores pulsing in tight spirals, as if probing the air for change. Nearby, Dr. Corrick crouched over moss and petal fall, vials clinking as she dipped sterile swabs into the undergrowth. Markin yawned, shoulders stiff, and snapped open his pack. "Morning," he rasped. Corrick looked up, eyes bright with triumph. "I've isolated 3 spore strains: soil, statue residue, and airborne." She pressed a tiny vial into his hand. "Statue residue, ancient quarry rock, traps organic lattices like a prison. We'll see if Fenverden's bloom is more evolved." Blue sat up, joints creaking. "Statues whisper," he rumbled. "Sculptors' souls, right?" Corrick rolled her eyes with fond impatience. "Legendary hyperbole, but if marble entraps biochemical signatures, those whispers might be nothing more than channeled air currents reacting to heat, thermal differentials, acoustic resonance." Beam's spores pulsed. Impatience. Markin shouldered his bow. "Let's move." They threaded past silent statues and into Fenverden, arriving as merchants opened for the day. The workshops stood crooked among alabaster fronts. Half-finished statues littered the yard, their hushed forms ghosting in the morning mist. They began asking the people around town if they'd seen a girl named Cassandra in the past couple weeks. A hushed fear clung to the streets. Whispers of fever, of neighbors killing infected neighbors. Half the town, they learned, had been stricken and died within the past few days. Blue, concerned about the fear in people's eyes and the way they looked at Beam, decided they should stick together and called out to Markin from across the street. A sculptor's hammer froze in mid-strike. He lowered his chisels, eyes widening. "Markin," he whispered. He looked up in Markin's direction. "The girl. She spoke that name. A girl. She stayed here. Fevered. Muttering Markin in the night." Markin's heart seized. Where is she now? The old man wiped sweat and charcoal from his brow, revealing slight dark streaks under his sleeves. Westward, toward Bostow, but she was sick. Not like the sick we have here. I urged her to rest, but she pushed on, said the forest would heal her. It wasn't like the sick we have here. This takes us within half a day. Beam's spores trembled. Urgency. Blue's horn veins flickered with cold light. Bostow. Then that's where we go. Markin swallowed, nodded. Oh, the man said suddenly, voice cracking. It wasn't a couple weeks ago, though. It was only 3 days. They left the sculptor clutching his chisels, dread and despair behind his eyes. The road to Bostow stretched for 4 hard days beneath a sun that felt too pale for spring. Each morning the party pressed onward, Markin scouting ahead, Blue and Cork trading wary glances as they rode. Beam's spores drifting in low clouds around them as he remained in warhorse form for Blue's sake and for speed. Markin wished he'd asked the sculptor if Cassandra had been on a horse. If she was on foot, they should overtake her in a few days. On the first day, a lone shepherd staggered onto the road, robes plastered to raw flesh by sweat and feverish rot. His knuckles bled where he gripped his gnarled staff. His eyes shone white with fever. A liquid leached from his nostrils, too dark to be blood. Bostow's gone, he rasped. The bloom took us all. His legs buckled, spine curving into the dust as he crumpled to the ground. Blue put his boot on the man's chest. He's beyond mercy. Blue slammed his foot down on the man's sternum with a sick crack. Markin whispered a prayer and loosed an arrow into the man's heart. The shepherd went still, a single ragged breath wheezing spores into the air. Beam's spores hesitated for only a moment before descending on the fallen shepherd and the air around them. The rain started as they left, and it didn't let up for 2 days, a cold, steady drip that soaked through gear, skin, and spirit, save for Beam, who seemed energized by the rain, even in his warhorse form. By the 3rd dawn, they rounded a knoll to find a merchant caravan broken in the dabbled shade of ancient oaks. Wagons lay on their sides, wheels twisted like gnarled hands. Burlap sacks lay ripped open, grain spilled like pale bones across the dirt. Survivors cowered behind smashed barrels, knives clutched in shaking grips. When Markin offered aid, they hissed refusals, insisting they'd limp on to Fenverden once their wagons were righted. A few hours later, on a lonely ridge, the party stumbled over the hollow husks of Malcian soldiers. Their once bright tabards were mottled with black fungal growths, their armor cracked and covered in spores. Beam hovered above them, spores drifting from his body like ghostly embers. In a silent pulse, those spores swept through the broken armor and shattered bone, stripping away every last trace of corruption until only empty shells remained. Exhausted, Beam's great form rooted itself to the earth, mind and body drawing strength from the soil. The others set up camp in the shadow of his mossy limbs. As dusk bled into night, Dr. Cork knelt among her instruments, lantern light dancing on vials and charts. She murmured through hurried notes. The bloom amplify its virulent nature with our current trajectory. Absent the myogenic activity emitted by Beam, statistically speaking, at least one of us would exhibit symptomatic colonization by now. 2 hours into the day, the skyline of Bostow, the trade city backed up to the Kenwich River and rose up over the horizon. Its once proud stone walls now slick with creeping vine. A ragged wail drifted across the plain as dozens of afflicted stumbled toward them. Farmers in tattered smocks, gilded merchants swathed in silk. A lone city watchman still clinging to his shattered shield. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, limbs twitching with unnatural urges. Markin ranged back, loosing arrows, one through a farmhand's peaked cap, another through the jugular of a priest. Each shaft dropped a target, but more surged forward. Beam spores erupted, a viridian wave that stung exposed flesh and burned rot from bone. Yet the tide pressed on. Dr. Korik, with the remarkable strength of her mechanical arm, hurled dark vials of violent tincture. Each explosion seared pockets of infected, leaving charred bodies in its wake. Blue crashed into the fray like a living hammer, axe whirling through infected peasants and noblemen alike, even the shaft of his axe breaking through their brittle bones. Despite their fiercest blows, the horde's numbers were endless, the noise seeming to be attracting greater numbers. Markin glimpsed the gates torn from their hinges, realizing they were overwhelmed. "Fall back!" he shouted. His magic golden shields flickered around Blue as he staggered beneath half a dozen claws. Korik yanked Beam's arm. "Proceed this way, an optimal refuge." They fled up the hill, making their own path, infected shuffling at their heels until they reached the yawning mouth in the rock. The world shifted from heat and chaos to damp and cold as they slipped inside, breathless, steel slick with blood, hearts hammering with both dread and relief. Behind them, the moans of the bloom warped. They fought the dozen that had chased them into the cave's dark throat as quietly as possible. A single stalactite drip echoed in the hush, mingling with the soft hiss of Beam's spores. Korik's violet vials clinked together as she set them on the stone ledge, their liquid sloshing in the dim light. They sank against the rough walls, Blue pressing his back to the stone. Markin's arrows slipped from numb fingers onto the cave floor. Korik's breath came in sharp rattles as she took inventory. Beam drifted among them like living smoke. His spores pulsed golden green, settling on gashes and sores, flesh knit and infection destroyed under the quiet glow, burned back like rot on fire. Bruises faded, heat ebbed. When the last tremor left their limbs, only the soft crackle of spores remained. They picked their way down the hillside at first light, the cave's mouth bleeding them back into Bostow's ruined outskirts. From the hill they could see that the town lay in festering ruin, collapsed roofs, smoldering fires, bodies half buried in crawling vines, burned, or ambulating directionless. Markin's eyes welled up as he stood. "It's gone," he rasped, voice hollow. Korik knelt among the bodies that had chased them up the hill. "It would be categorically inadvisable to enter the city," she murmured, brow furrowed. "The biocontaminant load alone exceeds any tolerable threshold. Not even the direct inoculation of Beam's sporic remediation conferred survivability on these," she said, motioning to the dead husks around them. Blue's hand fell on Markin's shoulder. "Best leave it be," he rumbled. "This place, they're all dead or too far gone." Beam placed a hand of roots on Markin's shoulder. Spores pulsed. Doubt. Sorrow. But Markin's jaw set. "I refuse to believe she was in there." He rose. Dirt streaked across his face. "She was posted to the Medi outpost by those bloody guardians. If she escaped the bloom here, maybe she's there." Korik looked up, eyes bright despite the dawn's gloom. "The outpost," she announced, tracing trembling lines on her map. "Approximately 4 day cycles further north, undulating lowlands and peat-soaked marshes. I anticipate the bloom's pathological proliferation will be markedly exacerbated up there." Blue shook his head. "We don't quite have the supplies for that. Wish we'd gutted that healthy dire boar." Korik's brow furrowed as she contemplated. "Indeed, I neglected to initiate my supplemental foraging protocol sooner. Nonetheless, I can guarantee at least 48 hours of consumables en route." Beam's spores swelled. Resolve. Markin cast one look over Bostow's shattered gates, shoulders squared against the wind. "That ration estimate," he said, voice unwavering, "will just scrape us through, but who knows if we'll find another settlement with stores to restock. If anyone feels compelled to turn back, I won't fault you. It's not cowardice, it's survival. She's not your sister, and I understand that. But myself, I'm going to find her, no matter what the cost." He met each of their eyes in turn. Blue's horn veins dimmed, a steady pulse above a stern, quiet expression. Beam's spores rippled with quiet affirmation, and Dr. Corrick's lips curled into a fierce, eager grin. With a shared nod, Beam began his warhorse transformation, and they trotted north into the gray morning light, every hoofbeat carrying them one stride closer to the outpost, to hope. 4 days stretched before them, each mile a step farther into a land haunted by the bloom's creeping shadow. They pressed north through wind-tossed marshes, low hills sodden with morning mists, and forests where every living thing seemed to carry its own quiet threat. The Kenwich River to their east swelled with spring rains, its banks lined with bleached bones of beasts long succumbed to the bloom's infestation. The rain had softened the earth ahead into sludge, completely engulfing the road. They veered west, but by midday they trudged through a sprawl of open wetlands. Once farmland, now nothing but rotted fence posts and slumped scarecrows choked in mold. The marsh was thick with fungal overgrowth and ankle-deep water. Strange growths bloomed from submerged tree trunks, pale bulbs that pulsed like lungs and popped when stepped on. Ahead, a crumbling windmill wrought with black fungus listed in the muck. A man waded beneath it, if he was a man at all. His spine was too straight, too rigid, and his skin had the waxy sheen of meat left too long in the sun. He held a lantern with no flame. Beneath his hood, his face was handsome, but pale. "No road forward," he rasped, as if choking on gravel. "The land's taken. Fish rot. Trees breathing, birds burst mid-flight. Turn back. Turn back." Beam's spores reacted, twisting in the air like they had recognized something old and unwelcome. Blue shifted forward, axe slung low, voice quiet. "Too late for that." Dr. Corrick was already scanning the field with a reagent vial. Her voice clipped. "The bloom density here is critical. Spore matter in the air, in the water, in the marrow of the wood." She thumbed the vial. "I can clear a trail, narrow, temporary. 20 minutes if Beam supplements." Markin glanced back. The man stood still beneath the leaning mill, unmoving now. A thread of blood hung from one nostril. "We move," Markin said. Beam rooted a hand in the mud and exhaled spores, this time finer, thinner, surgical in their weave. They hissed on contact with the bloom, carving a tight corridor through the tainted landscape. The group moved quickly, Corrick spraying blooms that reached too close, Blue cleaving one wretched thing that resembled a cow but had too many mouths. Halfway across the flats, the screaming began. From the reeds rose infected, once folk, bearing aprons, farmers' hats, faded uniforms, a dog with no jaw, a child missing half her ribs. They came silent first, then shrieking. Markin's bow sang, Corrick lit the sky violet, Blue roared through the tide of flesh. When the last figure dropped, impaled on a rusted fence post, Markin looked to where the windmill once stood. It had collapsed. Of the hooded man, nothing remained. No one spoke as they pressed on. Beam's roots, slick with ash and blood, didn't tremble, but Markin thought he felt them flinch. Markin accompanied Dr. Corrick and slipped away from the firelight, her silhouette framed by flickering embers. She moved with that nervous precision of hers, every motion calculated yet somehow graceful. At a decent distance from camp she knelt, unfolding a squat brass and leather pot. From it rose tendrils of fragrant smoke Markin didn't recognize, twisting through the humid night air. As the inviting smoke curled, he noticed they were on a game trail. She arranged a series of small spring-driven snares, thin wire loops held taut by coiled mechanisms, each baited with vegetation. As soon as they returned, Cork began dismantling her toolkit. She unfolded a collapsible net the size of a blanket, its frame strung with an adjustable sail-like vane of taut fiber and shifting gears. With a few turns of her wrist, her left arm a marvel of polished brass joints and etched steel plates, the net contracted into a compact bundle, the vanes snapping into place. She turned the mechanical fingers of her prosthetic arm clicking softly as she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Field work, my dears," she said, looking upward to the night sky. "Science never sleeps." When dawn's pale light touched the clearing, Markin blinked awake to the scent of roasting meat. Dr. Cork crouched beside the fire, two small rabbits speared on a bent branch above crackling embers. Beside her sat the collapsed sail, and a wide-mouthed jar of wriggling insects sat on a flat stone. "Protein," she explained with a grin, her mechanical arm whirring as it scooped handfuls of beetles and grasshoppers into her mouth. She chewed thoughtfully, then extended the jar. "Entomological delights, rich in chitin, high in keratin. Try some?" Blue's tongue flicked out, tasting the smoky tang, and he snapped a small handful of insects between his tusks with a pleased grunt. Markin, however, shook his head and pulled the tender rabbit off the spit. The meat was gamey and warm, its juices steaming in the crisp morning air. "Not quite ready for bugs," he said, slicing a hunk of rabbit with his dagger. "But this is... thank you." Cork popped a locust in her mouth and winked. "Your loss, but I respect gastronomic boundaries." She deftly placed a lid on the jar and stuffed it into her coat pocket. "Fuel for our journey's metabolic demands." Beam stirred, spores drifting lazily as he politely refused the meal. The group ate in companionable silence before shouldering packs and remounting for the road. The ground gave way to reeds and knee-deep muck. The rain was light as they followed a deer path that sloped toward a shallow lagoon, its surface shimmering with floating fungal blooms. A chorus of croaks rose from the shallows, amphibians warped into nightmares, bloated frogs with spore blooms for warts, salamanders whose bellies glowed with sick green heat. Beam stepped forward, spores pulsing in anticipation. He raised a limb, a single pulse rippling outward. Every toad and newt convulsed, their skin blistering as toxins bloomed from within. Cork dashed forward, net aloft, capturing live specimens for her notes. Blue and Markin finished off the worst, Blue's axe cleaving through fang-lined jaws, Markin's arrows piercing the soft underbellies. Rain-slick grasses trembled under the weight of distant shouts. Through the haze they saw ragged figures stumbling toward them. They didn't move like the infected. Women clutching children, old men with hollowed cheeks, young men and women a circle around them, all barefoot and bloodied. Behind them a line of Malcian soldiers advanced with cold precision. The soldiers' steel helms gleamed under wet skies. Their blades dripped with mud and something darker, crusted along the edges. Even from this distance they could tell the lieutenant's face was carved by years of hardship. He barked something, and then more clearly, "No quarter! Burn it all!" Markin's bow dropped to his side. "Wait," he whispered, voice breaking. "Are they infected?" Blue's horn veins crackled in silent fury. He flexed his battle axe, but they were too far away. Cork's usually animated eyes dulled. "My people," she said quietly. "From Midbor." She knelt in the mud, her face twisted in pain. Beam's spores trembled in the air. Horror, confusion, sorrow. He shifted on his roots as bark cracked and splintered, his torso elongated, vertebra uncoiling like living timber, while his arms thinned into sweeping wings of polished wood and feather. Moss peeled back to reveal sleek obsidian talons. His head reared up, gnarled roots twisting into a hooked beak the size of a warhammer's blade. With a final resonant pulse of glowing spores, Beam launched skyward, the giant eagle cutting through the mist. The Malcian line loosed a volley of crossbow bolts. Refugees fell like autumn leaves, mothers clutching empty arms. Children's cries cut short. Soldiers moved forward in grim formation, blades flashing as they dispatched those who still clung to life. They quickly set fire to the bodies and returned to the line. By the time Beam swept across the marsh, it was silent save for the crackle of fire and the ratchet of loading crossbows. The Malcian patrol had reassembled in a half-circle, their wet armor glinting in the dim light. Each soldier cocked their weapon, eyes narrowed behind helm visors, waiting for Beam to stoop into their range. He spiraled once, talons clicking like timber on stone, chest heaving. Only then, spotting no twitch of life among the battered refugees or blood-slicked bodies, did he break the dive. With a mighty beat of monstrous wings, he returned to his friends. His descent shook reeds loose. The great eagle shrank, wood grain folding back into living bark and root, until he once again stood among them, silent. Marken had turned away, stomach knotted. Korik looked up, her face pale beneath streaks of rain, a mixture of anger and sadness on her face. Blue's axe lowered slowly in defeat. Beam raised a single pulse of spores. Anguish. Before drawing back into the shelter of the woods. None spoke. The soldiers marched on, leaving only broken bodies and the stench of burning flesh. Marken swallowed hard. We leave them? Korik's voice was a whisper of detachment and grief. There's nothing more to be accomplished here. Together they trudged across the marsh until once again finding solid ground. Compelled by guilt, and the unshakable question echoing in every heart. Which side were they truly on? Chapter 14. That evening the fire sputtered low, embers glowing like dying eyes as Dr. Korik arranged her vials on a flat stone, each glass orb containing a different tincture, some glowing violet, others a sickly chartreuse. Her fingers, stained with unknown reagents, moved with frenetic precision. Marken sat cross-legged, watching the spore-clouded night. Tell me, he said quietly, what is Midborg like, where you come from? Korik paused, swirling a vial of liquid that shimmered with suspended spores. She tapped the back of her metallic fingers against the glass. Ah, Midborg. Imagine a land of restless steel and smoke. The capital, Blackwell, sprawls out on the east side of the great Calbo Lake, its skyline pierced by smith fires and alchemy chimneys. My family, minor nobles, though in Midborg the term is elastic, owned one of the smaller manufactories, crafting mechanical water wheels. She uncorked the vial and dipped a slender rod into the liquid. It hissed as she dribbled a drop onto a moss sample. I, self-styled ethnobotanist, proto-mechanical savant, autodidactic alchemist extraordinaire, was bred to questions. I clambered through ruined greenhouses to catalog plant anomalies and built mechanical pollinators from scavenged bronze. Yet in Midborg many tribes remain primal. Each river clan, mountain folk, marsh-born people worship a different god, natural phenomenon, or type of magic. Superstitions bloom like mushrooms. River sorcerers who coax fog with incantations, hill seers who read your marrow by torchlight, earth priests who bind roots to flesh. She leaned back, eyes reflecting the fire. When the bloom first appeared, many saw it as a divine reclamation, others as a plague. My siblings fled on barges. I stayed, driven by curiosity and by guilt. I watched neighbors transform, skin cracking, thoughts unraveling, yet none stopped to ask why. Only how to survive. Compassion and calculation warred in me. I offered tinctures to stem early rot. Some lived, some died with my name on their lips. Korik's voice softened. She tucked a strand of short black hair behind her ear. I do this now because no one else will. Science demands sacrifice, yes, but I refuse to lose more souls. If I must chase spores across continents, so be it. but I will save what I can and understand the rest." The fire crackled in response, and in the hush that followed, Markin felt her words settle like ash, grim, yet tinged with an unexpected warmth. They took turns at watch while Beam's spores drifted low around his resting form. No gentle pulses, no flickers of emotion. In the lantern's glow, Markin realized something uneasy. Since the Malcian soldiers butchered and burned those people from Midborg, Beam's spores had held still, silent. Slipping from his bedroll, Markin crossed the circle of firelight to where the druid stood rooted. His mossy bark was motionless, his legs rooted deep in the soil. Markin laid a hand on Beam's broad shoulder. The druid did not stir. In that quiet moment, Markin felt the weight of absence, the friend who spoke without words, but whose spores had woven hope and courage at his darkest, now rested, silent. He wrapped his arms around the tough bark and stone, awkward and difficult as it was. A faint wisp of spores drifted upward, barely perceptible, but enough. The fourth dawn found them on sprawling meadows, pampas grass bowing beneath a laden sky. Smoke curled on the northern horizon, thin, desperate streaks. Riding closer, they discovered a battered cart surrounded by a dozen refugees, locked in a life-and-death struggle, with a pack of bloated wolves, each pelt mottled with fungal lesions. Markin dropped from his saddle and loosed a volley of 5 arrows in as many heartbeats. 3 hissed into rotted flanks. Frothing jaws snapped too late to turn the beast's maws. The 4th buried in a spine. The last cracked through a snarling snout. As another wolf lunged, Markin's breath caught, and instinctively his hands glowed with golden light. Time stuttered. The beast's open jaw hung frozen mid-snap, its teeth stalled inches from a child's throat. Blue met the wolf's skull with a thunderous swing, its head hitting the ground hard before rolling past a woman running to scoop up the child. Beam's arms dug into the earth. Roots sheathed in phosphorescent spores burst from the turf, weaving around lupine legs and yanking them free from muscle and marrow. With a roar, 2 more wolves charged. Cork hurled a vial of violet reagent at their feet. The smoke hissed, fur curling into ash, collapsing them in choking spasms. They circled the smoldering cart, their ragged breaths misting in the chill morning. Half the refugees wore the blue and gray of Malcia. The rest draped themselves in charred shawls and ash-stained leather, faces flickering between hope and dread. Cork knelt beside a trembling woman, her skin oozing dark lesions. "Remain calm," Cork murmured, scooping the ooze into a vial before moving methodically from one survivor to the next. When at last she stood straight, Markin cleared his throat. "This'll sting," he warned, voice low. "But if Beam's able, he'll try to burn the bloom from you." He glanced at the druid. In the pale light, Beam's spores shimmered. Comfort. Stillness. With a low groan, he shifted his weight. His bark-like skin crackled as a cloud of phosphorescent spores billowed from him, settling over the wounded in a glimmering haze. The spores clung and burned, hot and white, searing the bloom from flesh and bone. One man, black veins throbbing from scalp to toes, screamed as the purifying haze crawled over him, searing agony trailing his breath. When the acrid smoke and smell of burned flesh cleared, Beam exhaled again, and a second wave of softer green and amber spores drifted down, knitting shredded muscle and sealing charred sinew back together. As the wounds closed beneath the soft glow, Beam let his roots sink back into the earth, eyelids heavy from exhaustion. Around him the refugees stood in stunned silence at their renewed bodies. Markin stepped forward, addressing the Malcians. "You're not militia. Why risk everything by crossing borders?" A tall man in mud-caked leather armor, his sword still sheathed, raked a hand through his dirt-streaked hair. "We came because we believe," he swallowed thickly, "that Malcia still stands for hope, for mercy. Not every noble in my country will welcome us back, but if Midborg dies here, who are we? Have you not seen what our military is really doing here? It's slaughter, nothing more." One of the Midborg refugees, a young mother clutching her son's hand, choked back tears. "We have nowhere else to go," she whispered. "All of Midborg is like this now." Blue hefted his great axe, boots sinking in the trampled grass. "If you carry the bloom into Malcia, then everything we fight for dies with you." Dr. Cork straightened, placing her hand on Blue's forearm. "We can institute stringent quarantine protocols," Cork intoned, her voice measured and precise. "Given access to a fully equipped laboratory, I could propagate additional cohorts of Beam's bioregenerative spores. In the meantime, we'll incinerate all contaminated encampments and personal effects, then detain each individual under controlled observation for a defined period to surveil any emergent symptomatology. Our decontamination repertoire is extensive. We cannot abrogate our ethical duty to aid the innocent." Markin's jaw tightened as he met that little boy's wide, fearful eyes. But he also saw Cork's confidence, her careful notes fluttering in the breeze, proof that hope and perhaps a cure might still be within reach, if they could survive long enough. He swallowed. "We'll help you get to the border," he said at last, voice low. "But first we ride north to the Medi outpost. My sister was stationed there. Once we find her, we'll find a way to get you into Malcia, safe and clean. I won't let the bloom march straight into Malcia on your backs, though." The Malcian nodded, relief and fear warring in his gaze. The mother hugged her son tighter, nodding again, tears on her cheeks. Blue cracked his knuckles. "It's risky, but we might not even make it that far anyway. Let's move." With resolute steps, the ragged procession set off beneath the laden sky, hope and dread entwined in every heartbeat. Beam walked slowly, roots tugging free with each step, spores trailing like smoke from a dying lantern. Blue kept to the flank, axe in hand, eyes scanning every rise for movement. The refugees marched in silence, their wounds mended but their spirits raw, scarred by flame, loss, and memory. Markin glanced once at the boy clinging to his mother's side, thinking of his own mother and sister, then up to the horizon where the Medi outpost waited. Behind them, Dr. Cork turned once to look back. "Time is against us," she muttered, more to herself than anyone, "but it is not yet our enemy." And so they walked into the gray morning, into whatever waited in the north. Thanks for listening to War Beneath the Roots. If you enjoyed this story so far, consider following or subscribing and leaving a review. Until next time, keep your blade sharp and your fire burning.